Imagine turning a simple gray outline into a professional hand-painted masterpiece. Hi everyone, welcome to the grand finale of Perfect Pairings for 2025. You've made this such an incredible year for our Altenew community. To celebrate, I'm pulling back the curtain on my 3 biggest secrets for flawless, no-outline watercoloring. Let's get painting. The Botanical Elegance Capture the Colors of Nature watercolor coloring book is a game changer. I love the realistic illustrations of the flowers featured in this paper pad. Each of the 12 images has a black outline and a light gray outline pairing. This way you can create 24 varieties of watercolor masterpieces. The page I picked from this coloring book is a deliberate choice. I like that there is a single row of petals in the hibiscus. There is some overlap in the petals and the leaves. And overall, it's a great image to practice your gray outline watercoloring. I tore out both the black outline and faint gray outline pages from the watercolor coloring book. One for reference, the other to actually color on. For some of the more complex images in the watercolor book, you may want to keep referencing the black outlined image. I found that this helped distinguish petals, leaves, petals over leaves, especially once we start adding color. It gets a little difficult to tell them apart if your eye isn't trained for it. The color palette I'll be featuring on this card is the Watercolor Compact Deep Muse, the collaboration palette between Sarah Simon, the Mint Gardener, and Artistry by Altenew. I went live on my channel with this palette, and this color story was a big hit. The colors are Raspberry Rose, Lilac Burgundy, Golden Ochre, Mossy Oak, Still Waters, and Origin Umber. I'm going to give this palette a quick spritz of clean water from my Fine Mister spray bottle to help loosen the pigment in this palette. Hold down my panel during watercoloring. I'll use Altenew's Satin masking tape. This is held up for many watercolor sessions for me, even after applying light washes of water to watercolor paper. I'll leave a very thin margin of tape on the panel, then let the rest adhere to my Crafter's Essential cutting mat. Pro tip for you, use the Altenew bone folder to burnish the tape to the watercolor panel for extra security. Also burnish the very edges of the watercolor panel to the tape with the fine edge of the bone folder. I've got that black outline off view here for reference if you need it while watercoloring and color mapping. For me, I like to use 2 shallow trays of water, one for cleaning my brush and one as a mixing water or hydrating the palette pigment. I highly recommend a paper towel to blot off pigment before returning the brush to the cleaning brush bowl. This helps extend your water bowls and keeps them clean for the entirety of painting. You don't want to bring your unclean water to the palettes and contaminate the colors. There is a palette in the lid of the watercolor compacts. However, I love the Petal Palette for easy visualization of these watercolors, and it's just beautiful on my painting desk. Lastly, I'll need my fine watercolor brushes. The sizes are 000, 1, 2, 4, and 6. I won't use all of these brushes, but also which brush you decide to use if you're following along is going to depend on your comfort with watercolor brushes. Now that my workstation is set up, let's plan a little bit. On my notepad, I roughly mapped which colors I want to use for each element of this hibiscus. I know the list is numbered, but I won't go in order as I paint. I used Golden Ochre as a petal base color and leaf accent color, Raspberry Rose as an overall petal hue, Lilac Burgundy for petal details and veins, Still Waters for the stem shadow layer and leaf shadow layer, Mossy Oak for the leaf hue, and Origin Umber for filling in the stem. Color mapping first is going to establish hues or your solid colors or underlying tones. Overall, the warm base of the watercolor palette is going to give a warm tone impression. But mixing these layers by using the transparent quality of watercolor is going to give your final masterpiece a dynamic and interesting edge, allowing the colors to define the shape rather than the printed lines. I'll keep this color map off to the side as well, so I can quickly reference it and cross items off as I finish them. Now that our work area is prepared and we have a plan for coloring this gorgeous image, let's work through the watercolor in 3 phases. I want to take my largest brush in the fine watercolor brush set, which is the number 6. I will be using this wet on wet technique to apply a wash of clean water to the petals or leaf elements. Then I'll use a very dilute color wash to drop in the color and let the water take this pigment for a smooth blend. I'm taking the pigment out of the pan and onto the Petal Palette to help visualize and dilute the color before placing the brush onto the watercolor paper. We aren't trying to fully saturate the paper with water, nor are we trying to saturate the organic petal shape with pigment. We are making a simple color map of tones, shadows, and by leaving some areas uncolored, we are also creating highlights. I know for the leaves, I am applying golden ochre to tips of leaves and leaf shadows. Then I'm also applying heavier washes of golden ochre to the tips of the hibiscus petals, as well as the hibiscus center to tone the petals this lovely golden yellow. I'm keeping the illustration loose and dropping in pigment onto the wet surface. I'm also keeping in mind my hand placement. I'm right-handed, so generally I'm trying to work from the top left to the bottom right of my painting so that I don't rest my palm anywhere on the wet paint and accidentally transfer this pigment to another spot on my canvas. Before returning the brush to my cleaning water bowl, I'm making sure to wipe off the excess paint from my brush on the paper towel. Then I will gently swirl the brush in the shallow cleaning bowl. This is just one aspect of my underpainting. We will continue to build on these layers. I'll cross this off my planned color list and move on to raspberry rose and adding another hued layer of pigment to the petals. I'm referencing a similarly colored hibiscus that I found online. I'm still using wet on wet techniques, but this time with less water and slightly more pigment. I want to concentrate this color toward the center of the hibiscus and blend this pigment out toward the golden ochre and the petal tips. Layers of hibiscus petals dry back as I color in others, so I take this opportunity to add in more layers of raspberry rose to color in the petals of the hibiscus. This layered approach really helps make sure your images are also relatively the same hue. You don't want one petal to have less or more saturation of color than the other, and also as you work through your project, you might notice that the pigment looks different when it's fully dry than when the watercolor is wet. This gives you another opportunity to add more washes of color as you observe the piece as a whole. Moving down the list, I'm going to let the petal layers dry back before adding any additional layers. So I'm moving down to number 4 with still waters. With this watercolor, I'm going to start with very light wet on wet washes of still waters on the leaves. I used golden ochre to set tones throughout the hibiscus leaves. Now I'm using still waters as more intense shadows where leaf layers overlap and also where leaf layers naturally curl. I'm also adding some vein details to the leaves by following the light gray outline of the hibiscus image. No details are being added with this layer of pigment yet. I'm working around the leaf layers, ignoring everywhere I established tone, and simply thinking of the light source as casting a shadow on this element. Then I will add a wet on wet layer of still waters. I also used this dilute still waters pigment to start adding curvature and shadows to the herbaceous hibiscus stem. Again, I'm right-handed. Generally, I feel like my light source is on the top left so that my hand doesn't cast a shadow onto my painting on the bottom right. If I think the stem is curling away from me, then I will add a line of still waters along the stem. I'm still using the number 6 brush, by the way. If you feel more comfortable with a thinner bristle, feel free to use the number 4 or number 2 along the stem. Moving down my color mapping list, let's fill in the leaf layers with solid washes of color now. Just like the petals, I'm going to apply washes of more pigment and less water as a glaze over the golden ochre and still waters pigments. I'm using the still waters washes as a guide to apply mossy oak over the leaves. Since I was deliberate with applying the still waters and golden ochre washes, all I have to do is fill in the leaves with mossy oak. The technique is more dry on wet. Then I will use my clean water bowl to diffuse and blend the gradient to let the toned gradients come through underneath. Creating this depth should be a relatively easy step since we worked hard to define shadows with other watercolor layers on the leaves. There are leaf images throughout my watercolor canvas, so I'm making sure as I pick up color from the watercolor pan set that I'm establishing the same value and range of mossy green color so that one leaf isn't necessarily more saturated than the other. If you're not comfortable with getting the tip of the watercolor brush to come to a fine point for these serrated leaf edges, this is also another opportunity to move down to the smaller brush sizes. Especially with these more concentrated washes of color, it's important to wipe off the pigment on the brush on your paper towel before bringing the brush to your cleaning water bowl. It helps keep your pigments vibrant in the pan and on the canvas. After filling in the leaf layers, I'll move down to the number 2 brush. I feel like I have established an overall tone to the canvas, and now I want to add in detail shades to the arrangement. As the leaves and the petal layers are drying back, I figured this was a good time to add and fill in the stem layer with Origin Umber. Origin Umber on top of still waters makes a beautiful Payne's Gray mix and instant shadows on the stem. Unlike the other previously applied light layers of pigment, adding this wash of Origin Umber should work up in no time. Because of all the detail work we did previously with the shadow layers, and like the other previously applied light layers of pigment, adding this wash of Origin Umber should work up in no time, because all the detail work we did previously with the shadow layers. After that, I'll work in still waters and lilac burgundy to fill in detail layers. After this point, I'm adding in my stylistic touch. I love adding curved contour lines as a linear detail, vein detail, and just my way of adding artful movement to a bouquet. I love adding these feathery strokes to petals to help give the illusion of petal curls. I also added these same veining details and contour lines to random areas along the leaves, just to visually unite the two images. I haven't mentioned too much about the closed hibiscus bud on the top right area of the illustration, but I have been applying washes of color to this partial image as well as these veining details. As areas dry back from painting and become less vibrant, I'm building more concentrated colors until I get to the point where my brush is nearly dry with pigment. I love dry brushing as a stylistic approach to watercolor as well. I think these deliberate and stylistic choices create even more movement in the arrangement. But this is my perspective on watercolor and what I like to do. Some folks create beautiful and realistic gradients. For me, I like seeing brush strokes and this textured appearance to the painting. This is a painted representation of a hibiscus, not a photo after all. I used dry brushed layers of nearly all the colors in Deep Muse Watercolor Compact along the petals, stem, and leaf. Aside from filling in the details and adding dry brush strokes, I also filled in the stamen and anther. I wanted to do this at the very end after the majority of the image was dry, so that this layer appeared distinctly separate from the rest of the petal colors. I used touches of raspberry rose and golden ochre to get that vibrant flower center. After this image has completely dried, I can remove the satin masking tape and begin finishing this very simple card. A pro tip when it comes to removing the satin masking tape from your watercolor paper, you'll want to peel the tape completely in and on itself and away from your watercolor sheet. This way the tape lifts cleanly from the watercolor paper, but then if there's pigment on the tape, it won't transfer to your piece. Have both of these happen due to my negligence, absolutely, so make sure you go slowly when peeling the tape. You definitely don't want to ruin the work you just worked so hard to paint. After removing all the tape, I cut the thinnest 1/8 inch margin all around the image to cut the uncolored outlines from my painting. Then I stamped a sentiment directly onto the watercolor panel. I love the scripted sentiments from Craft Your Life Project Kit, Magnificent Magnolia, and this large "You Are Special" sentiment was the perfect fit to fill this space on the bottom left area of the painting. I stamped this in the stamp wheel using Obsidian Pigment Ink to easily give a solid black fill on top of the textured watercolor paper. Another stylistic choice I make is splatter. I added both pure white and jet black ink spray splatter as a filler to open spaces of the background. After the splatter dried, I applied the 1/16 by 1 inch wide instant dimension foam tape to the entire backside of the watercolor panel. Then I foam mounted my finished stamped painting onto a landscape-oriented 5x7 folded note card base. While I didn't have a lot of warping on my panel, adding the foam tape gives this card this professional and flat finish to this card. By filling in a base layer, building shadows, then finally adding detail, you can simplify your approach to gray outline or fade outline watercolor coloring to give the illusion that you painted and illustrated the image yourself. Another year of gorgeous Altenew releases has passed, and I hope that you'll join me again in 2026 for even more card making and paper crafting tutorials and techniques. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video if you haven't already. Infinite perfect pairings exist all around you. I'm excited to keep delivering techniques and tips so that you can love your new releases and continue to love your existing Altenew stash. Thank you for joining me all year, and I can't wait to see you at the next video.